Hey everyone, my name is Ben Seymour. I'm the program coordinator for the Health Professionals Recovery Programs here in the state of Idaho. I'm also a certified alcohol and drug counselor, certified intervention professional. I've been working in behavioral health for close to 25 years now. And I work primarily with impaired professionals. And so what that looks like is I work with licensed healthcare professionals who are suffering from substance use disorders, mental health concerns, and other issues that I'll be addressing today. So today's presentation is going to be talking about professionals. So my goals today are going to be to give you a better understanding of substance use disorders as a whole, but more specifically how they relate to healthcare professionals and other professionals across industries. I'm also going to give you an overview of HPRP, which is the Health Professionals Recovery Program here in the state. I'm going to talk about resources, and I'm also going to answer previous questions from previous lectures that I've done and work that into the presentation. Before I get started, I always like to thank my friend and colleague, Dr. Kevin McCauley. He has done the movie Pleasures Unwoven. If you've never seen that movie, I highly recommend it. They're actually going to be redoing it and bringing it more modern to the latest brain science, but I incorporate some of his brain science into the presentation. I feel that he's done the best job really explaining how substance use disorders affect the brain. And that's really important, I believe, for anybody working with people with SUD to understand the interaction between the frontal cortex and midbrain and why we see the behaviors we see and why certain modalities are more effective than others. And I'll get into that today. Really quickly, I like to start with some studies out of JAMA and talk about how addiction happens to healthcare professionals. As I said, I've been doing this a long time, and really addiction research has come a long way since I started in the 90s. And now we have the brain science to back up things that we intuitively knew back in those days. But it's not uncommon for me to be doing a lecture or presentation and to have individuals puzzled by how does a doctor get addicted to drugs, and there are a lot of misconceptions that somehow they should know better or they should understand the brain science and that would prevent them. So we'll really kind of tackle some of those stigmas and misunderstandings today as well. So in 2010, JAMA did a study of 1,891 physicians, and it showed that 17% of physicians personally knew of an impaired colleague. 67% of this group reported their colleague to a relevant authority, and the remainder did not do anything about it. Those in smaller practices were found to be less likely to report a colleague who was impaired, and there are a lot of factors in that I'll get into today in the presentation. The usual studies that we see, and I see a lot of numbers, but typically the average is 10% of the general population in the United States suffer from a substance use disorder. So roughly the numbers we see are anywhere from 20 million to 25 million individuals suffering from a substance use disorder at any given time. Most studies of physicians specifically show that a 14 to 17% percentage of that population suffer from a substance use disorder, which is higher, as you can see, than the general population at 10%. This is pretty consistent across licensure. So when we talk about nurses, when we talk about pharmacists, dentists, even attorneys, we see higher percentages typically hovering around the 15% range. And there are factors as well that contribute to that. But typically when we see higher stress, higher demand careers, we see higher rates of substance use disorder. And some of that is it'll make sense in the presentation today, but some of that is how individuals are wired. And the challenge of the career, the demand, the high risk, the high reward, all those things really infiltrate the same parts of the brain that drug high do. And so certain behaviors also manipulate the brain into releasing chemicals that drugs mimic. And so we'll talk about that as well today. Mayo did a study in 2014 showing 50.3% of doctors with SUDs were alcohol dependent, 36% opiate dependent. Those numbers are still pretty accurate. I'd say the majority of cases I deal with are typically alcohol and then prescription drugs. So in essence, healthcare professionals are 50% more likely than the general population to develop a drug or alcohol problem. But why? And this is a complex answer, and there's so many variables, but we're going to talk about that today. So real quick, I like to lay out an understanding of the brain before we get into this, just so that we kind of understand how the brain operates, because that really contributes to the factors that we see cause somebody to pick up alcohol, drugs, and other problematic behaviors. And so when we learn about all the senses, there's actually 10 senses. I know in school as a kid, I learned about the first 5, but there's actually 10. So we get into 6 and 7, we get into angular accelerations, and that's balance. So when we see somebody have vertigo, typically 6 through 8 are one of the ones that get impaired there. And the blood actually has the ability to know when to expel and take in oxygen. It can actually determine if there's the blood gas measurement intuitively. And so we actually have that as a sense. But the 10th sense we're going to talk about today is pleasure. And that is where impairment happens. And pleasure actually helps us maintain survival, right? And so that is ultimately the whole purpose of pleasure, and we'll get into why that is. So really, when we talk about this state that we see typically precede addiction, for a lot of the patients I see, I had a couple years where I sat in my office and I just did thousands of assessments. And I would say easily in 70% of those cases, I would interview somebody, talk about their mental health, if they ever noticed depressive symptoms. And typically the patients reported somewhere around the age of 8 on average, somewhere around that age, they report that some kind of depressive state came over them. And so research shows that this is actually more about a different part of the brain. When we're talking about depression, we're talking about serotonin uptake, the frontal cortex. Really, when we talk about anhedonia, we're talking about a different primal part of the brain. And that's typically, through research we know now, that that's typically what we see precede somebody picking up alcohol or drugs. And we'll get into why that is. But basically, anhedonia is defined as a pleasure deafness. So the patient's no longer able to derive pleasure from things that were pleasurable in the past. Medically, this is related to impaired dopamine levels. And as a result, the patient begins seeking new activities to stimulate and self-soothe. And so when we talk about a broken pleasure sense, what are we really talking about? And so we're talking about stress, but I feel the word stress doesn't really articulate or get into what we're looking at. We're talking about trauma. And when we get into individuals with substance use disorders, studies show easily that 70% of people who suffer from an alcohol or drug use disorder typically have some kind of trauma that goes along with that, and preceded, in most cases, the first episode of use. So when we look at the brain, we're talking about dopamine uptake. So dopamine actually helps us sustain survival. And so every human actually has what's known as a hedonic set point, and that's basically a threshold that recognizes when an event is pleasurable. So for example, if I go to Disneyland and I ride a ride, my brain releases dopamine, it hits that threshold and tags that as a pleasurable experience with dopamine. Job promotion, kid doing well in school, all these events and things help us know that, hey, these are pleasurable and to continue these behaviors. But under chronic and severe stress, what happens is the hormones change and that threshold gets raised. And so we'll talk about why that is real quick. And so when we look at somebody who is under chronic and severe stress or experiencing trauma, their brain has to be able to function at a much more efficient way. And so that threshold gets raised basically to help them function at a higher level, because now the stakes are raised. So the example I always use of this is if I take 2 kids and take them to Disneyland, and one kid is from a stable household where there's consistency, he has coping skills, he has dinner on the table at the same time, he's loved, he's nurtured, and his brain is developed with those self-soothing techniques and coping mechanisms. And I take that kid and I put him on, let's say, the Matterhorn at Disneyland, and I interview him afterwards. His eyes will be dilated, his heart rate will be increased, he'll look at you with excitement, you'll ask him to describe the experience, he'll relive it, he'll tell you every detail of that experience. Now, if I take a kid who comes from a traumatized household where he's chronically abused, or let's say he's growing up in a war-torn country, and he is functioning on a completely different level than the other child, and I interview that kid getting off the Matterhorn, his eyes won't be as dilated, his heart rate will not be as increased, and he'll kind of have a flat affect. You'll ask him to describe the experience, and he'll say, I don't know, it was okay, So he has a totally different experience. So now I take those 2 kids and I take them to a keg party. Let's say they're teenagers. They drink the same amount, pound for pound, eliminate those variables, but then I interview both those kids the next morning after that event. The kid from the stable household typically is going to have a hangover, be sick, and not going to have this kind of cathartic experience that the other kid's going to have. So this kid will say, I don't know, I got dizzy, I felt out of control, I don't like feeling out of control, I feel sick today, I don't really really understand the big idea. And if you ask that kid if he would do it again, he'd say, I don't know. He's not really going to have a set answer on that. But then I take the kid from the war-torn country and I say, hey, how was that experience for you? Now his eyes are dilated, his heart rate's increased, he's reliving the experience, and he says it was amazing. What happens is that alcohol release, similar to drugs, releases a spike of dopamine that now hits that threshold and gets tagged with survival salience and is tagged as a pleasurable experience. And so now this kid is describing, I felt comfortable in my own skin. I didn't feel self-conscious. I wasn't worried about the things that are happening at home or wherever I live. I felt comfortable. The fear went away. He's now having this experience of where a coping skill is actually meeting his needs. And so those kids have had two totally different experiences. And so what we know is that under chronic and severe stress, two things change in the brain. And so number one talks about novelty-seeking genes. So these are extroverted genes, risk-taking genes. And so a lot of times with people that I've interviewed when I'm doing a drug and alcohol assessment or an intake evaluation, typically what they describe is that around that age of 8, when that anhedonic state set on, they then began seeking things that were more pleasurable. And so what that looks like a lot of times for kids is extreme sports. Maybe they're riding their bike off the roof. And parents, I ran parent groups for a number of years, and they always describe this, right? Is that the kids somewhere along the way began taking risks, getting in fights at school, ditching school, doing these risky behaviors that previously they never would have done and are uncharacteristic of that child. So what we know is that if we're not getting that part of our brain tagged with that survival salient, we begin looking for other survival mechanisms or things to make you feel something. 2, the dopamine neurotransmission changes. So under chronic and severe stress, the brain's not producing as much dopamine, and it's actually not hitting that threshold. So larger risks, larger amounts of substances are needed. Another piece that ties to professionals there under number 1, if you look, is that those who choose high-risk careers, typically that's very similar to extreme sports or whatever it is. They tend to be drawn to things that are higher risk, higher reward. So my question is, do you think doctors face stress? Do you think lawyers face stress? Do you think that nurses face stress? Absolutely. If anything, COVID really showed us that how much of a toll, the stress of healthcare takes on our healthcare staff. A 2014 review published in the Medical Student Research Journal stated that physicians have a higher rate of prescription drug abuse than the general population. And again, I didn't want to bore you with all the studies, and I state physicians in here, but really this applies pretty consistently across licensure types. So same with pharmacists, dentists, nurses. Dentists are actually the highest suicide rate. They recently surpassed attorneys. And so these are all high stress jobs and careers. And so when we talk about stress, it's true that we all face stress, but not everybody faces the same severity patterns of stress in their lives. The other piece is that not everybody is taught the same coping mechanisms as a child. If you've ever studied child development, you know that there are certain benchmarks and metrics children need to meet to really create and adapt to coping mechanisms, stress, and life. And so that doesn't happen systematically for kids growing up. And so some people don't learn those skills for whatever reason. So the other piece of this is genetic and developmental variables, such as, we don't all show up with the same brain. So not everybody processes things the same. Not everybody views one experience the same. And so when we look at stress or trauma, it's important to understand that trauma is real or perceived. And so we could have two people that experience the exact same situation, and one of them may be traumatized by it and the other one may not. And so a lot of this is relative to the individual. So the role of chemicals, when we look at this, there's evidence that people with extroverted reward-seeking genes and certain personality types tend to show higher levels of dopamine activity than other more introverted people. Several important diseases also of the nervous system deal with dopamine. So when we look at Parkinson's, it's actually related to a decreased amount of dopamine in the brain. And then we look at other disorders such as ADHD and schizophrenia, and they're actually related to elevated and increased levels of dopamine that then cause side effects and fallout within the brain. Another example of this hedonic set point would be a fever. So the body has several of these, but fever is really a good one. Typical body temp is at 98.6, but if we get an infection or some kind of illness, the body raises the temperature to kill off that infection, and then it'll reset and come back down. So it's same with the brain can reset and come back down. So when we look at the early study of addiction and substance use disorders, really nobody knew where in the brain drug high and addiction took place. And so initially, I think with good reason, people always went to the frontal cortex because the frontal cortex is the rational decision-making part of the brain. And so it wasn't actually until a series of studies in the 50s and 60s with mice that Dr. Olds and Dr. Milner discovered that drug high actually took place in a different part of the brain. And so because the addicts, typically people with substance use disorder, alcoholics, whatever you want to, nomenclature you want to use, typically exhibit what we would consider poor behavior, driving under the influence, perhaps not going to work, dishonesty, all these different behaviors that society views as antisocial. And so they really started to look at the frontal cortex. Well, they developed a probe that could release cocaine and then electric stimulation to the brain of a mouse. And what they did was they started dosing the frontal cortex, and nothing was happening. And so pretty soon they began moving the probes all around the brain of the mouse, and they really understood that the drug high took place in a more primal, deeper part of the brain. And the way once they found the spot where the brain reacted to the cocaine and the electric stimulation, what they did was start to introduce other survival mechanisms. And so they basically were able to, they would release food in a food pellet. You can see a picture of the mouse here. And what they would do is they would take the mouse and introduce the food, and he would stand there and press the lever and keep eating. And when it was hungry, it would keep eating. Then they would dose the mouse with cocaine, and the mouse would never go back to the food pellet. So they introduce a pedal where the mouse would press for food pellet and one that would release cocaine, and the mouse every time would go back to the cocaine, never going back to the food again, and would actually starve to death. So a few different things happened here. So, the frontal cortex is the part of the brain that deals with rational decisions. That's where we associate emotion, we associate love for things like our personal interests, problem solving, motor skills, reasoning. All these things are very frontal cortex. And so what these experiments basically showed was that drug high did not impact that part of the brain initially. It did secondarily, but in the midbrain is where the drug high actually took place. And it was in two specific receptor sites, the ventral tegmental receptor site and the nucleus accumbens, and I included a slide showing where those are located. And those two specific receptor sites in that mid part of the brain deals with one thing, and that's survival. And so there are actually three key mechanisms that we have survival for. And so we need dopamine, and dopamine is a pleasurable feeling for this reason. And the human, any living being needs something to motivate it to sustain its survival, to know, hey, I'm hungry, I need to eat. Hey, I am being threatened by a bear right now, I need to either kill it or get away from it. We also need to know that we need to pass on our genetic information, and that's why sex is also tagged with dopamine, which is considered a pleasurable experience, so that we know to sustain our survival and procreate. And so this part of the brain is very primal. I call it the caveman part of the brain because, really it's running in the background. We don't notice that it's there typically unless we're under severe stress or threat. This is the part of the brain when we see fight, flight, freeze. This is the part of the brain that deals with that. And so typically when we look at addiction, what we're looking at is, there were a lot of studies on survival and animals and species. And if we have two animals that are, walking through the forest, the ones with lower survival instincts are typically not going to survive. And so these when we talk about, genetic trauma and generational trauma, typically, families, that information, that DNA, that mental blueprint gets handed down generation to generation. And so basically kind of the takeaway, key findings of this study was that, the brain tags these survival mechanisms with dopamine. The other part of the experiment that they did was they actually were able to, that was an electrical grate. Let me see if I have another picture of it. Let me go back real quick to show this. So that's an electrical grate you can see that the mouse is standing on. And so what they would do is they would take a cage that has a grate that's obviously got electric going to it, and they could turn on or off, and then they had a safe part of the cage that the mouse could go stand and be safe. And they put the lever over the electrical grate, and they would put the mouse on it and introduce the electric stim. The mouse would get off, and they would introduce it, and it would get once it was safe, it would go back on, press for food, but if it turned on, it would go back off, away from the food. But once they introduced the cocaine, the mouse would stand there and continue to press the lever for more cocaine, even at its own peril of electrocution. And so that proved that basically the cocaine had the ability to override that part of the brain that sustained survival. They would also introduce other mice in there for it to mate with, and they were able to prove that the cocaine would also override the ability to procreate. So again, back to the takeaway, these survival salients are very, very key in our survival. And they were able to prove that dopamine and drug high, the drugs were actually able to supersede the others because the amounts of dopamine that are released from a hit of cocaine or other drugs dwarfs any other survival mechanism that the brain can produce. And so the dopamine now serves as the number one reward for that mouse. And it's the same with humans, right? In the mind of an addict or someone with an SUD, drugs basically equal survival. Now, the other piece of this that this experiment did was it eliminated some of the social taboos around addiction. Not that that got out and that people really understood the nuance of that, but that, these mice, they didn't press the lever for more cocaine because of social factors. There's a TED talk where an individual talks about, the rat park and mouse park and those studies. And those are pretty controversial studies that I don't necessarily agree with, because they talk about social variables for mice and things like that. And while in recovery, when we look at arresting addiction and substance use disorders, social integration and social variables are a contributing factor. They don't supersede the brain science of what really happens in the mind of someone with a substance use disorder. And I'm going to get into some of that now as to why that's kind of a secondary thing. So the other piece of this that's important to understand is that the frontal cortex really is about rational decision making. The midbrain is about just keeping us alive. So a human example of this that I would give is if I'm a police officer, I respond to a domestic violence situation, and I walk into a home and there is a man with a gun fighting with his wife, there are kids around, and the man aims the gun at me as a trained law enforcement officer, then my job is to neutralize the threat and basically eliminate the threat, and then you weigh out the collateral damage at that point. And so you don't have time, the brain does not have time to say, well, this is a really sad scenario, I'm sorry the kids have to see this, how are his kids gonna feel? You don't have time to weigh out those frontal cortex kind of decisions. The midbrain knows it's under threat and it needs to sustain its survival, and so it shuts down that frontal cortex. And so that's why under chronic and severe stress, any of us can probably relate with this, when we're under chronic and severe stress, we make poor decisions. This is why. And so when we look at the role of the midbrain versus the frontal cortex, typically the frontal cortex, it works top down. But under chronic and severe stress, that frontal cortex has to shut down because it becomes a liability. And so when we're looking at addiction, we're actually looking at people who are real or perceived again, under more chronic and severe stress. And that, like I said, that can be due to lack of coping skills and all kinds of other variables. But regardless, people with SUD typically are far more susceptible to stress. And so what we see is that frontal cortex is not fully online. If somebody is in active addiction, actively using, what happens is that dopamine transmission changes, and the midbrain is saying, get me what I need to survive. And that frontal cortex is not online. I myself am in recovery. I've been in recovery over 25 years, and I remember so many days waking up saying, I don't want to drink today. I don't want to use anything today. Yet by 11 o'clock, I was doing it again. And what happened was I would wake up in the morning, my frontal cortex online, feeling the consequences of what's happening in my life, realizing this is not a healthy decision. Yet as the day progressed and the stress started to build, I could not find that part of my brain that did not want to use. The voice that said you have to use to manage this stress. And pretty soon the picture got gray and it got fuzzy, and I was off and running again each day. And so when we look at people who are really suffering from a substance use disorder, the brain is processing stress on a chronic level of life and death, saying, stress is basically threatening my survival. So the dopamine surges basically caused by the drugs now become the number one coping mechanism. And so in the midbrain, it's basically saying, I need to get this to survive. And so an example of this that we always use is like the midbrain, like I said, is running like an operating system in the background. And so if I walk into a room and let's say I'm going to a presentation and I walk into a room and there's wide open auditorium with chairs and I see people I know and people I don't know, before I am saying, oh, there's my friend Joe, I'm going to go sit by Joe, the midbrain is running at a level of life and death. And so it's saying, there's a room full of chairs. Am I under attack? Am I going to eat the chair? Am I going to kill the chair? Do I have sex with the chair? So it's processing those kind of three main survival mechanisms in the background. And once it says, okay, it's not a threat and I'm not going to eat it, and obviously I'm not going to procreate with the chair, then it passes that up to the frontal cortex as a safe situation. The frontal cortex says, okay, where do we want to sit? Okay. And so the midbrain is always running. The problem is with addiction that the brain gets hijacked, the frontal cortex gets hijacked, and individuals under the effects of these disorders are actually running around on a level of life and death on a regular basis. So now that it knows what its number one survival mechanism is, what does the brain use to motivate the individual to repeat it? So for example, if I'm hungry, I need to know I need to eat, right? Otherwise I won't survive. And so that's where hunger comes from. It's actually a phenomenon in the brain that then says, okay, you need to eat. Same with threats and so on. So craving, when it comes to addiction, and we talk about that being the number one new coping skill, we're talking about craving. And craving is not something that we can really explain to somebody who doesn't have a substance use disorder. But the analogy I always use is, there's a movie called Alive, and this came out in, I believe, the 90s, but it deals with the soccer team that crashed and in the mountains, and they had to resort to cannibalism. And so typically what I do is I'll ask a room of people, how many of you would eat another human? And nobody's hands go up. I've had one presentation where I was doing this presentation for a group of law enforcement officers who already kind of knew the answer, and one guy in front raised his hand and said, I would definitely eat people, and all his buddies were like, yeah, he would eat people. And I found that really funny. But anyway, so as we look at this, it's like nobody really thinks that they would ever resort to that kind of living, and until they're into that situation where their survival is threatened. And so history has shown that humans are capable of doing that behavior to sustain their survival. But in our rational frontal cortex, we think that that's impossible. Yet that midbrain makes it possible. And so that's the best example that I can really give to somebody who doesn't suffer from a substance use disorder, how desperate the need is to use for someone who is in the grip of a substance use disorder. It is on a level of life and death, and it feels like every part of their being is threatened until they get that next hit, drink, whatever it is. An example of this, and now we have brain science to back all this up and we can prove it through brain scans, but this is an example of an individual who was in recovery, early recovery, and they did put him in a scan machine and then started showing videos. And they started showing him videos of nature and relaxing things, and as you can see there, that midbrain's not lit up. But then they started showing footage of old neighborhoods, paraphernalia, and all these kind of things, and you started to see that craving actually happen and light up in the brain. And that part of the brain is also very tied to cellular memory. And so when we're talking about craving, it's, when I'm working with people early in recovery, everything is a trigger. And so if a song comes on the radio, it reminds them of who they were with the last time they used and where they were, and it can actually trigger a huge craving. And I always say there's a difference between somebody walking down the street, seeing some random person smoking a joint, versus walking down the street, seeing someone they used to use with and someone they know smoking a joint. Because if it's someone they know, it triggers a whole new cellular kind of memory around that creating craving. So the oversimplified kind of takeaway and breakdown of this is ultimately that stress equals craving. And so that if I put any individual with a substance use disorder under enough chronic and severe stress, eventually their brain is going to resort to mentally craving drugs. It doesn't mean they'll use necessarily, but their brain, they cannot control the craving. And the example of this is, in the old days, there was an example, they would say, well, addiction can't be a choice, because if I took you to a bar and I put a gun to your head and I said, take a drink, and if you take the drink, I'll shoot you, their argument was that the alcoholic would choose not to drink. Well, while that may be the case, if you put a drink in front of an alcoholic, put a gun to their head and say, if you take that drink, we'll shoot you, they cannot choose whether or not they are going to crave and have an obsession around that drink. And so that's the difference. It's not always just the external behavior that you see, it's the internal suffering that that patient endures. So it's not that addicts and alcoholics and people with SUD don't have values. It's that in the midst of survival, craving, and chronic stress, they can't draw upon that frontal cortex where their values are stored. And so the midbrain is ultimately running the show. And so conscious thought becomes constricted and free will fails. So when we look at addiction amongst healthcare professionals, the key contributing factors that we typically see are is that practicing medicine is stressful. So we already have the stress exposure, which is a key component to trigger the craving. Chosen field of medicine, people who choose working in medicine or law or any of these high demand careers typically already are under chronic and severe stress and enjoy it. So there is a healthy level of stress. And so the problem is that when that line gets crossed, sometimes it's not always clear. The environment of practice, when we look at exposure, we look at exposure to stress, we look at exposure to trauma, we look at exposure to crisis. We also look at exposure to drugs. And while most healthcare professionals typically choose alcohol because it's legal and it's available, there's also a huge percentage of individuals that will use prescription drugs. The hours of work are another huge issue. When we look at healthcare, it's increasingly becoming stressful, right? We look at more documentation requirements, insurance scrutiny, all the things that basically create a workday for healthcare professionals. It just gets to be bigger. It's not improving. And studies are showing that actually administrative tasks are the biggest stressor. And so increasing administrative red tape and tasks is the number one contributing factor to this problem. So that's another thing when I'm talking to healthcare administrators, I really like to stress that, us eliminating lengthy chart reviews, like basically taking like the EMR, electronic medical records, making them more succinct, eliminating redundant paperwork, all these little kind of things that administrators have control of, at the end of the day, really make a difference for the people in the front line practicing. Size of patient load is another contributing factor, exposure and access, and then healthy narcissism. And I'll talk about healthy narcissism. So, when we evaluate people in various careers, everybody has levels of narcissism. And so it's a scalable attribute. And when we look at good healthcare professionals, the ones who are the best typically have healthy levels of narcissism. The problem is that a lot of times these can get askewed, especially with a SUD or another mental health factor. We can see those kind of become extremely exacerbated and overpowering. And so those are things that we also, play into somebody picking up drugs and alcohol. I'm going to give an overview of HPRP here real quick. Let me check my time, just see how I'm doing here. Okay. So the first PHP, and when I use the word PHP, so when we look at these programs, they're typically referred to on a national level as a physician's health program or a PRN program. So a program for recovering nurses, a pharmacy recovery network. There's also, dental programs. So when we look at the US, typically, I would say 48 states, I believe, have programs similar to ours. And these programs are specifically designed because we know that if you take a punitive stance towards substance use disorders, it increases the amount of incidents and crises that you have related to individuals using. And what I mean by that is if I am a physician and I know my license is going to be revoked or suspended or taken, and I have an addiction problem, and I feel that I cannot tell anybody about it because I'm going to lose my license immediately, then I'm going to go further underground with that. And what that means is that eventually some kind of malpractice, death, some kind of major crisis or situation is going to happen as a result of that. And so healthcare programs, airlines realize this, a lot of these people that we see that have these diversion programs understand that it's actually better to have an open door policy about these things, talk about it. Pretending it's not there doesn't do anything. Punishing people for it doesn't really do anything. Now, we need to protect public safety and we need to have very clear boundaries and parameters around it. And obviously people cannot be running around practicing medicine, flying airplanes, and practicing law impaired. That's obviously dangerous. But again, we're going to be able to better treat those individuals, identify those individuals when we have an open door policy and a safe harbor of some sort to where they can say, look, I got a problem, and we suspend or freeze their license. and then we get in and get them the help they need. And then once they're deemed safe to go back to practice, then we get them back in the workforce. So these programs really, our first program started via the IMA in 1986 in the House of Delegates. The first program in Idaho was known as the PRN, the Physicians Recovery Network. We recently underwent a new kind of rebranding, for lack of a better term, taking all these different programs that we had for dentists, pharmacists, all the different people, and moving them under to one umbrella, which is now referred to as the Health Professional Recovery Program. And this receives funding and support from the IMA, Board of Medicine. Also, malpractice and insurance companies donate large amounts of money to these programs because they understand it saves them in litigation. Hospitals donate, local medical societies and individual physicians also donate as well. So the threat of investigation and disciplinary action can deter an impaired doctor from seeking help, or healthcare professional. Again, I'm using doctor interchangeably with any other healthcare professional, to help for a substance use disorder, mental health issue, or other behavioral health problem. Fear of loss of professional status may even be more ominous for the family members. The program primary's mission is to assist providers to seek the help they need. And so my primary role with HPRP is I'm kind of there in the middle, and I am like a flow of information between all these different stakeholders. And so obviously we have the licensee, we have their employer, we have the board of whatever their license is, and then we also have the treatment resources. And so our job is really to, if we get a complaint or we have an individual self-report, to get them where they need to be, and then triage the information and parse it out where it needs to be to let people know what's going on. So there are two ways for an individual to enter HPRP. The first is a self-report, and that's an individual who has not committed a crime or had a reported work-related incident. They can self-report to HPRP. So, the benefits to this are it would typically forego an investigation, but that individual can pick up the phone. Anybody who works in any of these covered licenses can call me and say, hey, I've got a problem, and we'll coach them through what they need to do. We're going to make sure they get a proper evaluation and that they follow the recommendations of that evaluation. We're not just haphazardly saying, oh, you go do 30 days here or 20 days there or whatever it is. We actually have each of these individuals undergo a clinical diagnostic evaluation, and then it's very clearly outlined what the recommended treatment is. So addiction, substance use disorders, now even mental health disorders, the assessment process is getting much more thorough and detailed. And so basically we can say, just like any other illness, if you go to a doctor and say, I'm having heart palpitations, they're going to do a series of tests and they're going to lay out a very clear treatment plan. You need to have surgery, you need to take medication, whatever that looks like based on the findings. It's not going to be one answer for all. It's the same with substance use disorders. We don't want to just paint everyone with one broad brushstroke, but there are standards as to what the best treatment is. And obviously with public safety at hand here, we want to make sure that's at the forefront. The next way to enter the program is board mandated. So that's individuals who have been reported to the board or have a complaint filed against them. They may be referred to HPRP. I'm going to talk about the ins and outs of this a little bit. So a self-report, again, it enacts some kind of limited information flow to the Board of Medicine. So for example, if somebody calls the Board of Medicine and says, hey, we heard Nurse Jones has a drug problem, he, may be at risk. The board would then contact us and say, is this individual in your program? Have they been evaluated? Are they, taking care of what needs to be done? We would confirm or deny, right? And so there's a limited flow of information so that they know whether they need to investigate or not. So we will ask what to expect if somebody calls us and says, hey, I have a problem. We're immediately going to ask them to cease practice because obviously we don't want anyone getting hurt. We don't want people practicing impaired. Then we're going to provide a list of specialized evaluators. And assessing healthcare professionals is not something we take lightly. It's not something that just any old treatment center can do. It's a very specialized process. So they undergo what's known as a clinical diagnostic evaluation. And those assessments look a little different based on licensure type. But then once they get that clinical diagnostic evaluation, they sign releases. That information comes to myself and people within my organization. We basically hold them to the recommendations in there. So let's say it is found that they have a substance use disorder, they would be asked to enroll in our program and then follow the treatment recommendations. We provide forensic accountability. And so our levels of drug testing, they're not something you can dilute or cheat on. Again, we provide forensic accountability. So it's truly randomized. It's extremely meticulous. We utilize hair testing, blood testing, nail testing, and all kinds of 4 different drugs. We utilize some urine testing, but all samples are supervised, and there's no room for adulteration or manipulating results. So we make sure they follow the treatment recommendations. We have them enroll in HPRP if it's deemed necessary, and they can return to work once they have demonstrated they're safe to practice. So that's part of the evaluation, as well as we make sure that they are safe to indeed go back to work. And upon completion of the program, their license will fully be reinstated and unencumbered. The typical duration of a contract with us is 5 years. So again, we're monitoring these professionals, and that's based on national data. 5 years is the gold standard, and that is deemed, typically when we see the relapse rates greatly decrease. The Idaho board will suspend a license immediately and refer to HPRP. So if an individual is reported, what will happen is they will send them to us anyway. And basically what's going to happen is additional restrictions may be stipulated based on legal action, employer requirements, board mandates, and they will typically undergo an investigation. So they're going to go back and see if this person was practicing impaired, how big was the liability, were they diverting medications? They're going to be pretty thorough in their search. Typical requirements of a contract with us for SUD, like I said, complete that evaluation. 2, we're going to have you complete all post-treatment recommendations. Typically that could look like inpatient treatment. If they need detoxification, then entering treatment. Some people, it's shown that they have a low level of use and they're don't have a severe substance use disorder, and those people sometimes can get outpatient counseling or counseling, psychiatric support, therapy to support them with what they need to recover. But again, they still undergo that forensic accountability. Attending 12-step based support group, typically we will have them start with 90 meetings in 90 days, and 3 times per week is the minimum. So when a participant's in their 5th year of our program, typically we'll see them going to 3 meetings a week. Again, participation in 12-step sponsorship is deemed the gold standard. A lot of people have the misconception that there's no data with things like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. There's actually tons of data with 12-step based support, and they actually do membership surveys within AA and NA. And the data, it's good data because there's those are self-run, self-funded groups. There's no monetary gain, and it's all strictly voluntary. And so individuals who are taking those surveys, typically, I believe the last study they did was the average sobriety time in Alcoholics Anonymous was 8 years, which is pretty good. And compared to other things, when you look at like medication assisted and other treatment modalities out there. And that's why we have physicians, airline pilots, and all these individuals doing these groups, is because statistically speaking, it's the best thing out there. We ask them to attend caduceus groups. So there are specialized healthcare professional groups that they would attend. There is a thing called IDAA, which is the International Doctors in Alcoholics Anonymous. There are all kinds of large organizations like this that you don't really hear a lot about because they're kind of tongue-in-cheek, but these are actually large, thriving societies of recovering individuals who work in healthcare. We also have them attend specialized facilitated support groups. For example, they would see an individual counselor who specializes in working with healthcare professionals, and that would be in a group setting. So example, we may have a nurse support group that they would go to, or a pharmacist support group, or a physician support group, and those are facilitated groups that they go to, and it gives them a chance to talk about the specific struggles within those work environments. Because, again, it's one thing to be a recovering addict every day who abused pills. It's another thing to be a recovering addict who's a pharmacist every day and abused pills, because your hand is literally, managing the very thing that destroyed your life every day. And so there's an additional kind of risk that goes with that. And I think it's very valuable having colleagues and peers that you can talk to and say, this is what happened today, and talk about those stressors that people in a normal treatment group or a normal 12-step group wouldn't understand. We also have them undergoing weekly randomized testing. And when I say weekly, that means it could be anywhere as many times as 3 times a week. Again, our protocols, we don't allow for gaps, because in a court of law, if anything were to happen, we need to be able to testify and say, yes, this individual is not under the influence, and we need to be able to back that up with a strict chain of custody and forensic evidence that indeed is the truth. Luckily, hair testing, peth testing, we have testing capabilities today that can get a big retrospective kind of picture for up to 3 months, sometimes longer, depending on the substances, that we can say, absolutely, yeah, this individual has not used anything. We also assign a workplace monitor. So a lot of these larger healthcare systems understand the value of this program. And so if, let's say I'm a nurse going to one of the big hospitals, we will have somebody in there who we know is either a graduate of our program and understands it, or a supervisor supervising that individual and doing specified check-ins with them to make sure they're doing okay. We also look at work. One of the big things is night shifts tend to be a bigger trigger. Certain hour loads tend to be a bigger trigger. So we do put some guidelines and parameters around how many hours they can work in the beginning, because they're more susceptible to relapse in the beginning. So we will actually titrate them back into their full work life. Typically, like I said, most contracts with us are 5 years in duration. The intensity titrates. HPRP currently holds a 65 to 76% success rate based on license. And so typically our physicians tend to run in about the high 70s. Dentists tend to run in the high 70s, pharmacists in the high 70s. Occasionally nurses, we see a lower number, and that is for a number of variables, but sometimes they lose their health insurance if they don't maintain their job, which means that we have to parse together a treatment plan, which, there are all kinds of variables here. So, but again, typically, if you look at a 65 to 76% success rate, and success, just so everyone understands, is defined as 5 years completing their contract without one relapse. That is what we define as success. And there's nobody tracking and with forensic accountability, those kind of outcomes. So when we look at SUD as a whole across the nation, nobody can really touch airline pilots and healthcare professionals when it comes to the best outcomes. When we look at general treatment populations, typically, those numbers are skewed and subjective, because a lot of times you have for-profit companies who are tracking data to demonstrate how successful their treatment center is, and that data is not backed up with any kind of science. And so a lot of that is word of mouth, phone calls, and things like that, versus ours, which is all forensic accountability. Typically, even then, those programs are boasting 10 to 20% success rates, which is considerably lower. And that's, again, because they don't have the post-treatment monitoring in place. They don't offer the drug testing. Some do now, and they're starting to get hip to what we do and trying to integrate that into everyday treatment for everyone. But again, these outcomes are really, really good. Ours is one of the best programs in the country. I'm really proud of our outcomes and our data, and it's really great to see us getting these guys back to work. Of the 24%, or typically, that number fluctuates again, of the people who don't make it through the contract the first time, let's say they have a relapse, many of those people re-enter treatment and eventually succeed. Some lose their licenses, some stay in the program with no license. And occasionally we'll see some people continue on to the bitter ends, which is usually, death if they don't treat their illness. We have seen healthcare professionals go to prison. We've seen front page news things, across the nation. So again, these things can end pretty drastically if somebody doesn't get into the program and really do what they need to do. But most people of that 24% do re-enter the program and go on to work successfully. It just takes them a try or two. HPRP is in a growth process, expanding services to new licensure boards. And so again, we underwent a restructuring. As a result, the governor said he wanted to take, we used to have everything pretty fragmented into different silos, and it didn't make sense why under the professional occupational licensure board, they were tracking, other things such as architects and things that didn't really apply to healthcare workers. And so they were able to actually restructure everything and get everything under HPRP. And we've got some really great new blood in there. We're excited to see the growth. And so we're really, the social work board, vet med, we're seeing a lot of other licensure types that didn't know that these programs existed say, why don't we have this for our counselors? Why don't we have this for our social workers? We need this. And so again, the value is undeniable. It's not really something you can dispute. And so all the licensure boards that are aware of it are really starting to take a look at if it's appropriate for them. And then it becomes about us growing the awareness of these programs and getting the word out that they're here. These programs are vastly underutilized. That's what I can say. And again, back to my earlier point that these things going undetected is higher risk than us being aware of it and monitoring, obviously. And so we really need to get the word out to more people. And I'm doing a number of these presentations all over the state to let people know, hey, this program's here. And so if you have a colleague that's in crisis, there's help for them. And I will actually come in myself. I'm an interventionist as well. And if a healthcare organization says, hey, we have a nurse or a surgeon or whoever it is that we're worried about, I will facilitate a conversation with them and their human resources department and help them navigate getting that person the help they need and protect their job, protect their license and their career. So again, my number and my contact information will be at the end of this presentation. If you work in a setting like that or have an issue, you can always reach out to me via email or call me. So again, we also work with behavioral concerns, and this is kind of a different subset. It's not uncommon for us to see, a boundary violation. It's not as prevalent as substance use disorders, but occasionally we'll see maybe perhaps someone being inappropriate with colleagues in the workplace, explosive anger, perhaps they have a gambling problem or concerning mental health condition or whatever it may be. A lot of times, this is why we get people evaluated. We don't know. We're not going to assume to know what the problem is. And so that's why that assessment part, that clinical diagnostic eval is so important. Because it's not uncommon to have something that presents one way, but it really is another. We've started to see more physicians phasing out of practice or aging out of practice. So we see healthcare professionals who, they're getting on in years and they can't operate at the same level they did before. And so we need to assess, is there any neurological cognitive deficit happening that needs to be accounted for? Do we need to decrease hours? Do we need to increase support? What do we need here to help this individual kind of age out of practice without putting the public safety in jeopardy? Boundary violations for sexual things, these things have been in the news more, and perhaps we see a physician or somebody being inappropriate. Those are things that would also get referred to us, and I would refer them out for individual assessment, and then we would decide where to go based on that evaluation. Process addictions are becoming more common. I've actually treated physicians for gaming addictions, which to some people may sound like something they haven't heard, but it's actually happening more and more. And so there's very specialized treatment for that across the nation, and so there's not a lot of it. And so my job also is to really work with these treatment centers across the country who specialize in these kind of very small windows of individuals and can really get them the help they need. And again, assessing and working with healthcare professionals is a very, very specialized process, and there's really only a handful of places in the country that do it and do it well, and as well as treating healthcare professionals. And so again, my job is really finding the best and brightest of these resources and making them available to Idaho's healthcare professionals. So reporting a colleague, I'll talk about this briefly. Factors identified that influence reporting versus not reporting. Small practices are less likely typically to report because they have less physicians or less nurses or less, whoever else is working with them. And so typically what we see in these small rural communities, which Idaho has a lot of, is that we'll see that practice come together to kind of help this individual hobble through practice. And so it's tough, because that dentist, that individual may be the primary breadwinner for that whole practice, and if he's not seeing patients or she's not seeing patients, the practice suffers and everybody's livelihood suffers. And so we see people typically endure and tolerate more of this inappropriate, whether it's drug use or alcohol use, whatever it may be, in these smaller rural communities. So community shortage is another issue. The closer the system and the team, the more it will adapt to support the impaired individual, because it's like a family and they want to help. And it's hard to know when you're helping versus when you're hurting with these disorders. When am I overreacting versus when is this really a public safety issue? So it's none of my business. Well, we see increasing penalties for non-reporting these days, and it's becoming a more litigious society. And there's actually reporting requirements for the state. If you know that somebody is practicing impaired, you actually have a duty to inform us based on the Safety to Practice Act. So can we live with knowing that there was something we could have done to stop it? And that's what I always want people to ask themselves. If I know that a colleague is impaired and someone gets hurt and I didn't do anything, that's something that's going to fall on me. So how do you report? You can always call my office or direct line. Again, I'm going to have my info at the end. You can anonymously call Southworth Associates or HPRP. And sorry, I have the language PHP, but HPRP is the current name, and report a concern. And we address these concerns with the individual and will likely send them for an evaluation if warranted. You can also do an anonymous report to the board. They'll typically just hand you off to HPRP or to us. The Employer Wellness Committee, HR or director, That's another option. If you're in one of the bigger healthcare systems, you can always go to one of them and report. They're typically going to call us as well. But calling me is probably the safest bet of all those. I mean, I'm just saying that it foregoes some steps that may not be necessary. And just one more point that I like to make is that the Safety to Practice Act, so if you have a duty to report, calling me is the same as calling HPRP or the Board of Medicine or the Board of Nursing. So calling us covers that liability that you have, that you did something. So late to appointments, how to identify impairment. Typically we'll see absences. Absences on Mondays and Fridays is always a big one. Unknown whereabouts, unusual rounding times. It's not uncommon to see really impaired individuals tend to try to take later shifts, night shifts more, hold down jobs that are with less people that are overworked because they can slip through the cracks a little easier and kind of hide their youth. When we get into increase in patient complaints, increased secrecy, decrease in quality of care, careless medical decisions, incorrect charting or writing of prescriptions, a decrease in productivity and efficiency, increased conflicts with colleagues, mood swings is another big one I always like to say there, increased irritability or aggression, smell of alcohol, overt intoxication, needle marks, erratic job history, missing Mondays and Fridays, and irregular sized pupils. And again, there may be people you would never suspect or never detect. And so it's not uncommon for me to be fielding calls where people feel like they may be overreacting, and then they call back a year later and they're like, we should have done something then. Licensed professionals are not immune to SUD. Help is available. We do our best to be non-punitive and advocate for participants. And if you have a problem, your chances of recovery are above average with a PHP. So that's the thing I always like people to hear, is that this is not a death sentence. You're not going to lose your license provided you get ahead of this and do what you need to do. And again, those recovery rates show that if you're an impaired healthcare professional, your chances of success are much greater. And here's my contact information. I'm going to go ahead and leave this up here for a minute. If you have any questions, you're not sure if anybody needs me to come out and do presentations or talk to HR directors. If you're in one of the bigger healthcare systems, I do quite a bit of work with them. It's not uncommon to have the HR department call me and say, Ben, we got this guy, what do we do? And I walk them through what to do. And so that's my job and my function. And I do interventions all over the country. I'm often intervening on impaired professionals all over the place. And so if you have a friend or a colleague who is you need to kind of orchestrate an intervention to get them motivated to do treatment, and you need to be able to speak to licensure requirements, I'm glad to do that. It's not uncommon for me to get on the phone and perform an intervention in a healthcare setting, or in person. So I'm always glad to do that. So thanks for your time today. If I can help with anything, feel free to reach out. Thank you.